Welcome, Professor Bahadur. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Professor Kashyap. It's my pleasure. And I'm really intrigued by the Saga anthology and the collective, so glad to be here.
Thank you. Professor Bahadur is here today with us to talk about her book, Coolie Woman, and some of her recent works. I've been actually reading a little bit about the contemporary politics in Guyana. And honestly, this is my first dive into the contemporary politics of Guyana, mainly because I remain to be very preoccupied and often angry with politics in India anyway. So this was a very interesting and welcome distraction, actually. And also the politics in Assam, where I come from, is pretty fraught. But I'm sure you have been following with great interest with what's happening there. And I'm relieved today to find out that peace has prevailed after 5 months of political drama. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what has been happening in Guyana.
Well, this has been a 5-month-long saga, and I've been following it and sending WhatsApp messages to my friends in Guyana. And basically, it's like, is it over now? Is it over yet? Does this court decision mean that we're done now? And no, actually, there's this next step that can be taken in the judicial process. So I'm joking, but I'm also not, because so Guyanese went to the polls on the 5th of March, I believe it was the 5th. And we just this past week had a final decision that appears to be final, but I think the Granger administration, which has been in power for the last 5 years, they've declared their intention to challenge it in the courts. The new president, newly sworn in as of a few days ago, is Mohammed Irfan Ali, who is the standard bearer for the People's Progressive Party. And the People's Progressive Party was the party that fought for independence, and in the beginning was a multiracial socialist party. And Chetty Jagan was the first premier elected while Guyana was still a British colony. So very hopeful beginnings, based in coalitions and based in an enlightened understanding of our history as a colonized people descended from the enslaved and the indentured. And it is so tragic to know that those possibilities were really shattered. And Guyanese political history is a tragic one. And that's partly our doing. And it's also a casualty of Cold War politics, because the United States intervened in the 50s and the 60s in ways that deepened already sort of simmering existing divisions between Blacks and Indians in Guyana. And the end result was that two political parties that were essentially racialized emerged, and we're still there. Mm-hmm. There are some crossover members and cabinet members, etc. There have always been, say, a few Indians in the PNC, now known as APNU, and vice versa. But it's hard to be optimistic, I'll be honest with you. I'm in a difficult position because I'm a journalist still. I do many things, but I'm a journalist still. And I covered the 2015 political election in Guyana for Foreign Policy and the Pulitzer Center. So I reported on the election that put Granger in power. But, right, I think it's fair to say that we're in a pretty depressing place. For a moment, I felt good that, democracy had prevailed, because it seemed like Granger just simply would not accept the results of a recount. Mm-hmm. That all international observers, the Commonwealth Observer Group, the Caribbean, CARICOM, the Caribbean Community, all of them said, these results we certify to be valid. And it seemed as though he was just going to try to overrule that, right? So for a moment, you're happy that democracy has prevailed, and it's followed quite quickly by the sinking feeling that, oh no, we're just back in the same sort of hardened, polarized, racialized situation we've been in for half a century. So the party that democratically won, the party that is associated with Indians in Guyana, has strayed far from its roots, and they are dogged by their own corruption scandals.
Oh.
So what can you say? I mean, I keep hoping that civil society will be reinvigorated, that the lawyers, journalists, anti-corruption organizations will work to demand that we free ourselves from this colonial holdover.
It's the same. I'm sure you know. Indian politics, of course, has been dominating headlines for a while because of all the wrong reasons, and I echo exactly your feelings. More and more every month, not even every year, every month since the new government has come in 2014 under Modi, the India that I grew up in is just diminishing. And a few days ago they were about to show a sort of very garish celebration of Hindutva in the New York Times Square. I'm so glad that the civil society woke up, and I think this is where the role of the civil society, artists, writers, progressive people, they come in to sort of bring change. And I was delighted that that is not going to happen. But moving on from hardcore politics, I want to talk about your book, which is why we are here today. The Coolie Woman, I read it long ago when I was a grad student in Minnesota, and and so much I remember from it. So I remember the character of Sujaria very vividly. It is a biography of your great grandmother Sujaria, who sailed from Calcutta in 1903 to the plantations of British Guyana. And Sujaria was one of the many, almost 250,000 probably, or 200,000 women who were brought from India by the British colonial administration to the plantations. And in some ways, the book is also an ode to these women, I think. So I wanted to know, like, how did you stay sustained in this mammoth project that needed so much work, so much emotional labor, so much physical labor?
Hard-headedness, as we would say in Guyana. I'm one hard-headed girl, woman. Okay, so this was a difficult project in terms of the market, right?
Yeah.
But I was never doing it because of the market. I'm a former daily newspaper reporter. I worked for newspapers for 10 years, covering lots of different things, as you do as a reporter: politics in Texas, the Iraq War, local cops, courts. But much of my career was spent writing about immigrants as well. So I realized that actually, while telling the stories of other people, I was by proxy sort of approaching my own sense of myself as an immigrant, as a child immigrant. I'm a member of the 1.5 generation. So there are two ways to answer your question. What sparked the project? Initially was curiosity about my great-grandmother. My father told me about her when I was in my early 20s. And we had gone to Guyana. I just graduated from journalism school, and he was taking me there as a graduation gift. And it was the first time we'd been back since I was maybe 10 or 11. So I was quizzing him about our connection to India. And he told me that the closest link for us was Sujaria, his grandmother. And I will always remember his words exactly. He said, "I don't know much about her, but she was a pregnant woman traveling alone." Right? So that just raises so many questions. I was just curious about her. And that was in 1997. So over the next decade, I would do whatever research I could. If I was in Guyana, I was in Guyana to report on the cocaine trade in 2003. But I took the opportunity to go to the National Archives, and I found her emigration pass So she was pregnant. She was 4 months pregnant when she left, and my grandfather, Lal Bahadur, was born on the ship, the Clyde, from Calcutta to Guyana. So I also found his infant born on board pass. And it was this amazing document, full of intimacy, remarkably, because written in handwriting across the side, was pregnant 4 months. That's how I know it was 4 months. And typed in this was a question recorded about every migrant. Are there any visible scars? So for her, there was a burn mark on the left leg. So there were all of these traces, right? Traces of questions about what might have happened to her. Where did that burn mark come from, right? So to directly answer your question, I was curious about her. And this curiosity existed for a whole decade before I even started doing serious work or thinking that I could write a book and should write a book. But to step back even further, the reason why someone is hard-headed with a project that is not marketable is obviously it comes from somewhere deep in your psyche, some need. And for me, that goes back to our arrival in the United States, in Jersey City in the late 80s. I was 12. We lived in a neighborhood that was the base for the group called the Dot Busters, which was, sort of this ragtag bunch of teenagers, people in their early 20s, many of them with ties to the local police department, actually. And they killed someone. They killed an Indian American in Hoboken, about a mile from where we lived. And they beat an Indian doctor in my neighborhood, to the point that he suffered brain damage and couldn't remember what happened. So this was happening around us. Those were the events that claimed headlines, and rightly so, but there were a lot of other smaller scale things happening to people who lived in our neighborhood and to us. We had graffiti scribbled on our garage door, "Hindus go home," and we were spat at. Once my dad went to the corner grocery store to buy some milk or whatever it was, and he was chased by these boys with knives. And so there was always a feeling of siege and insecurity as an Indian-looking person, again, right? We were being targeted because they thought we were Indian. What do they know about British colonialism and how it has displaced people over the world? To them, we were Indian, right? So there we were being targeted for our connection to a place that I had never been to, and my parents had never been to, my grandparents had never been to. So in a way, it began with this insecurity around identity. But I do wish to emphasize that my book is not a roots narrative. Some people have read it that way. It's a book about gender and violence, fundamentally. So yes, I wanted to know who I was, right? That classic migrant question. But who am I in relation to this history in which women have been brutalized generation after generation? Where does that come from? And that's really what was driving me. Although back then I probably couldn't have articulated it in that way. I didn't understand it in that way then.
The book is prefaced with this little chapter or introduction, whatever you call a preface, called the C word. I have to say that I'm familiar with the word Coolie, very, very familiar, because the book is prefaced with this little chapter or introduction, whatever you call a preface, called the C word. I have to say that I'm familiar with the word Coolie, very, very familiar, because a lot of workers were brought in from central India to my state, Assam. Assam was annexed by the British in 1826, and they were employed in the tea plantations during the 19th century. The people who are descendants of this community of workers, they actually still live in Assam and forms one of the largest minority groups in Assam. And they also, quite predictably, one of the poorest communities in Assam. The rates at which they work are so terrible and so abysmal that actually send them into cycles of debt and poverty that still lasts generations. On the other hand, Assam tea is everywhere available, served in the richest restaurants in the world to the tea stalls on the roadside. And so this word Coolie, I just wanted to come in and say that is very familiar to me, but I know that the preface is also very warm homage to a negritude movement. And what were you thinking when you were composing this beautiful preface that sort of preceded the book, apart from the homage?
That's a really excellent way to ask the question. What was I thinking? It was definitely an anticipation, right? I anticipated that it would be a problem to have called this book Coolie Woman.
Mm-hmm.
And Coolie, as I explain in the preface, the etymology is from the Tamil Kuli, Kuli, that the Portuguese used to describe manual laborers. It means hire, literally, in South India at the docks, right? But in the Caribbean, it means something completely different. Through the machinery of British colonialism, the definition of the word was changed to essentially mean indentured servant, right? Not the coolie that is used in the subcontinent. And then it went through another change, basically in which it became an ethnic slur, right? So that whoever you were, whatever you had done with your life, whatever your hopes and aspirations were, you were still a coolie. So for instance, you could be the coolie doctor or the coolie lawyer or the coolie writer. We, especially given the fraught racial tensions in the Caribbean, in both Trinidad and Guyana, it's a hurtful word. But like the N word in the United States, it also depends on who is using it and in which context and with whom. So for instance, my father and his late brother, they would always like call each other coolie bye, right? Because within the community, it has a different valence. So to answer your question, what was I thinking? I was thinking, I need to explain myself. I need to provide an etymology. I need to provide a history. I need to provide a parallel, right? And the parallel is negritude. And I didn't come up with this. Actually, a poet named Rajkumari Singh from Guyana, who died quite young, actually, in her 50s. She had polio. She was the head of a group of artists and playwrights and writers. They call themselves the Messenger Group in the 70s in Georgetown, Guyana. And they were the ones to reclaim this word coolie and to say, well, don't whisper it. Don't muffle yourself. Say it loud, say it proud. I'm a coolie, yes. And that means that I have survived some of the worst things I could survive, right? So I do think that there's a misconception that I am using the word the title in the same way, polemically, as Rajkumari Singh and members of the Messenger Group were. I actually did not, right? I was thinking, I don't see myself as a polemicist. Others might disagree, but I was thinking of the multiple meanings of the word coolie, and coolie woman, the woman who carries the baggage of history on her shoulders. I was thinking, that in a way it is the perfect way to describe the women in this history and the women whose stories I was uncovering. So that for me, I was making a metaphorical choice, not a polemical one, right? And it was also historically accurate, right? This is what these women were called by the British and by successive others. And that in itself captures so much, because we're always struggling with the perceptions of others, and that is part of the burden that we bear, the charge of this word. So for the record, although since the book came out 7 years ago, I do seem to have been pulled into a group of artists and writers who are using it in a sort of new Coolitude movement. And I do also want to say that Kalto Rabuli, the Mauritian poet, the concept of Coolitude, especially as a parallel to negritude, is really his. And he's articulated this and explained it. So all due credit and props to Kal, right? So although I didn't intend to be part of a new Coolitude movement, perhaps that's where I am right now. And perhaps that's okay, given, I mean, even small things, right? Even small, ridiculous things that I don't even want to have a conversation about, like Indian matchmaking and the Guyanese woman character on that. I mean, given the ways that we continue to be misrepresented, even by people who should know so much better, not the matchmaker, but, you know, people in our lives who are journalists and academics and friends who we interact with, there's always a subtle edge, patronage, condescension. So yeah, maybe I'm sort of at this place in my life now where I am ready to proclaim, like Raj Kumari saying, I'm a Coolie, say it loud, say it proud.
I think that's beautiful. That's really beautiful because, the word coolie is not used very respectfully in India. It exists in many Indian languages. There's a Amitabh Bachchan film also by that name, I think. And I think in Assam, because that word has so much baggage and insult associated with it, I don't know when this happened, but the people who worked in the plantations, they are called tea tribes now, which is another sort of way of, I mean, why would you name a community after a cash crop? I think, and I was talking to a person from the community, and they say it's just insulting to be named after a cash crop, you know. But I think that push and pull that we see in the use of the word to search for an appropriate word is still there in other contexts. So I think it's beautiful that you have a collective, and you're also taking charge of the word and using it. That's really wonderful. One of the questions that maybe we can discuss sometime later is how actually the women who were brought in, they also maneuvered the various patriarchal structures with their with their intelligence, sexuality, and that caused, as you mentioned, some of the violence and backlash against them by the men. Is that right?
Right. So between 1859 and 1917, 165 Indian women in Guyana alone were murdered by intimate partners or would-be intimate partners. And this is a violence that, this is a violence that was repeated across the map of indenture. So there were very copycat, well, not copycat technically, but very similar cases in Fiji and in Mauritius and in Trinidad. And the weapon used against the women was the cutlass, the machete from the cane fields. And women were dismembered. And a target was often the nose, which was supposed to be a symbol of honor, right? So these were not only killings and maimings, but ritualized killings and maimings.
Yeah.
But, you know, this is the dark heart of the dark center of this book, and why so many people from our history find it difficult to read, and why I found it difficult to write. And what it involves is a kind of radical sensitivity or radical intersectionality to see the men who perpetrated these crimes as, in a sense, victims themselves and dismembered by a plantation system, an imperial system that emasculated them, right? And it is incredibly complex. I mean, how do you read that? Especially in a history where the direct testimonies of the people involved are to such a large degree missing, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, I mean, so many things are coming up right now. First, the ritual killings, they're actually legitimized by the Hindu epics. For example, when Shurpanakha, who is supposed to be a demon princess, which we all know now, she was just lower caste, most probably. Shurpanakha proposed to Ram, the human avatar of Vishnu. He cut off her nose, and cutting off the nose is a ritual to sort of insult and punish the woman, that because it is such a fundamental part of the face, and you would never be able to face anyone with that cut nose. So that was the whole point, to actually shun them into the domestic sphere forever, to never show their face again. That was the point behind cutting off the nose, actually.
So, I mean, a history like this, in which the voices of the main people involved are missing, really requires you to be avant-garde, so to speak, right? Because what it does is destabilize history itself as a genre, right? It opens it up to subjectivity, to ambiguity, contradiction, suspense. And these are things that we associate with the novel, right? Not with the writing of history. And I think of Derek Walcott's famous line from The Muse of History, right? History is fiction, subject to a fitful muse memory.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, I mean, the devices I used in Coolie Woman to tell this history had to be, what's the right word? Destabilizing, I guess. Right. So the use of questions throughout, the use of the personal, the use of moments of speculation, right? And in which I'm telling the story, really not of what happened to Coolie women, indentured women, but of what could have happened to them. So it's a story of multiple possible endings. It's a history that's written with the archive and also against the archive. Right? So it's a commentary on the archive itself and the gaps and the silences of the archive. So it has these meta impulses, and those were necessary strategies.
The meta impulses, the speculative essay, and the fictional essay. That brings me to your Stained Veil, which published in the Commonwealth Writers Magazine, called Adda, and later published as a short story in the feminist press anthology called Go Home. But in our conversations, you also called that it is a fictional essay. What might possibly happen? Is that where you're going toward in your next project, the fictional essay? And I, as a writer of nonfiction and fiction, I'm very intrigued right now to know what is a fictional essay, how to write it. So could you please talk about it a little bit?
The Commonwealth Writers Foundation commissioned that. They asked for a piece. And I am an essayist. That is the genre I'm most familiar with and comfortable with. So I believe they asked me for a short story. Right.
They usually publish short stories there. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So they asked me for a short story, and this was the way I knew how to do it. This is a short story about a folk song, the Stained Veil, right? Mm-hmm. Which is so popular that it's part of Bollywood as well, right? There is that famous film, Laga Chunari Mein Daag.
Yeah.
So I mean, I wrote a short story about a folk song. And the theme of home, right? It's very much about how women from traditional rural backgrounds, whether they're in Guyana or elsewhere, are in a sense the original migrants, right? Because they're moving, the migration from the father's home to the husband's home is the most complete rupture and break and loss, right? So I just wanted to play with that idea of the bride leaving her home, her in-laws, which is so rooted in Bhojpuri folk traditions, and sort of play also with the ideas of more traditional migration. So there's a couple, and I thought of them as, of my grandparents' generation. And they migrate to the US, to Connecticut, and then the husband passes away, and then there's sort of the transmigration of the soul, right? So in a way, in whatever story there is really just scaffolding for these ideas that are interconnected and that I want to play with. Right, so that's why I call it a fictional essay, because I'm in a sense more interested in the ideas than the people. I mean, I'm interested in the people. I mean, they were modeled on people I know, and the incidents. I mean, it involves a racialized attack, and so it involves political violence. It involves interpersonal violence, intimate violence. Those things are all real and fraught. But for me, the ideas and the connections between the ideas were a lot more interesting. And I wanted to see how those progress the way a plot might progress. How I could take that trope of home and turn it and twist it with each sort of movement physically and then movement of the plot.
Yeah,
but it's also because I know how to write essays and I don't know how to write fiction.
And you're doing avant-garde work. I mean, this is experimental, avant-garde, boundary, genre breaking. All these words that we use with new work, new style. And I want to write a fictional essay. Probably I have written one because I wrote an essay about what will happen if I meet the characters from Law and Order SVU in one of. So it hasn't happened, but what might possibly happen, because it is more of a fantasy fictional essay probably. So I'm really interested in this term, in the genre, and the possibilities that it might offer, especially I think in a project like yours, where so much is about filling up silences with imagination, with your imagination, and because these are not recorded, so you have to come in as a writer to fill up these gaps. I would love to end this discussion, this interview, by asking you about your future work or a new book that you're working on. It was published in the Griffith Review, The Tales of the Sea. An excerpt from it was published, and it also won, congratulations, the New Jersey Council on the Arts Prose Award for 2019. It would be lovely to sort of wrap up this conversation if you could give us a sneak peek or tell us a little bit about this book.
Yes. This book, very slowly in progress, has evolved. When I finished Coolie 1, many people asked me, what's next? And I thought, what's next? How about a biography of Janet Jagan, who is a fascinating figure. She was the first, quote unquote, American woman to be a head of state anywhere in the world. So Guyana's independence leader, Chetty Jagan, he studied in Chicago and DC. He came to the US as a student at Howard and then studied at Northwestern, and that's where he met her, Jewish woman from Chicago. And within 3 months, they were married. It was, a love affair, a traditional boy-girl story is the way she put it. And they were Marxists. They were, committed socialists. And so she is interesting on her own, just as a transgressive, border-crossing figure. That's where I started. But the project has evolved in major ways since I first conceived of it. She's still a part of it, but it's a more kind of conceptual book. It's kind of an essay. Mm-hmm. It will be kind of a book-length essay. And what it really is, has been preoccupying me is the idea of America, right? And so we're all living this in very immediate, troubling ways right now. What is it that this country stands for? It's always somehow, despite its many sins, been blessed with this image of innocence and the beacon to the world of democracy, right? The American dream. So what I'm doing is looking through through Guyana's political history, at various groups of Americans who cycle in and out of Guyana's political landscape in the 20th century, and Janet Jagan is one of them. She and her husband, because they were Marxists, were maneuvered out of power through Anglo-American alliance. The US and the British got involved to sort of redesign Guyana's politics so that they would not hold power at independence, right? And so in the 50s and the 60s, they were US intelligence officials and US labor organization officials, known as the AFL-CIA, on the ground in Guyana, disrupting things and increasing tensions between Blacks and Indians on the ground. So this brings us full circle to your original question about the politics of Guyana. They will allow me to interrogate the idea of America. The third group are African Americans who in the 1970s, in a sort of post-Ghana moment, relocated to Guyana. These were exiles from segregation and injustice in the United States. Many of them were Black power figures. Many of them had actually worked in Ghana for Nkrumah. Then they went to Guyana and were working for the dictatorship that was put in place by the CIA, the African-led party, right, run by Forbes Burnham. So their story, with all of its ironies, which they're fleeing an unjust system in the United States, and then some of them go to work directly for the regime in Guyana, which is also racist. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. And then the fourth group of Americans are the Guyanese who become Americans because the mess that's created by all of that leads to wide-scale migration. And Guyana has one of the largest out-migration rates in the world. At this point, it becomes a personal story, and again, the story of our coming to America and the dot busters. I'd mentioned that a lot of those young people had ties to the police department in Jersey City, and that connects back to African Americans and the police state. So as you can tell, it's incredibly complicated. It is about the plot, the people, but the idea is what serves as the glue. God knows when it'll be done.
No, good luck for that, and sounds like another fascinating book, and it has already been very well received, the excerpt that has come up. So I wish you all the best. And with that, we come to an end to this conversation. We are very deeply grateful that you took out your time and talked to us. And I hope your good luck for a new semester that you'll be starting in a few weeks at Rutgers. Be safe. Take care of yourself.
Thank you, Aruni. Thank you so much for the care that you put into this.